Now, detonate the reality bomb!
I will build a great, great wall.
Some alien race to come down and threaten us.
Is the singularity near?
The truth is out there.
The military-industrial complex.
The 7 mountains of the influencers of culture.
To be as gods, you know.
Change has come to America.
Catapult of propaganda.
From a secure location on top of the ridge in the heart of the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
The coyotes are howling in the holler, and that means, once again, it's time to fire up the microphone and pontificate. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert tonight. Oh, we got a lot of stuff to cover. So the opening news segment will be shorter tonight. Are the Clintons finally going down? Well, we can only hope. Hey, it turns out we really can drill our way out of the problem. On the other hand, we are reliably informed that climate change causes racism. Oh yes, and Veggietales are racist too. Big news, the Sanhedrin meets on Monday to consecrate the stone altar for the Third Temple. We'll talk to Rabbi Zev Porat about that in the final segment tonight. And coming up tonight, you know, it's really not paranoia when they have been trying to kill you for 1,400 years. Raymond Ibrahim, author of the new book Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. Our guest coming up in just about 15 minutes here on A View from the Bunker. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Derek Gilbert. You can listen at Spreaker.com, iHeartRadio. We're at Stitcher.com. We are now also on Spotify. You got a Spotify account, you can find A View from the Bunker there. We got links to all of those at vftb.net. which is the website. You can subscribe to the podcast if you're listening in the archives at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, or you'll find all of those links again at the website vftb.net, where the archives go all the way back to 2009. The mobile app, that's the easiest way to get all of these programs delivered directly to your smartphone, your tablet, or your iPod or other MP3 device. Mobile app, you'll find the links to the iTunes App Store and Google Play at vftb.net. Surprise, surprise. We're also at YouTube, youtube.com/Derek Gilbert. No video tonight, but we're working on that just in case you really, really need to spend 2 hours staring at me talking into a microphone. So keep watch on the YouTube channel, but the audio-only versions are also there at YouTube if you use that a lot. Social media, you'll find us at facebook.com/viewfromthebunker, Twitter at viewfrombunker, and oneway.com/Derek P. Gilbert. Well, big news this week from John Solomon at The Hill. TheHill.com is normally a left-leaning news site, reports on stuff in Capitol Hill, but John Solomon there has been doing some great work in recent weeks on recent months on the ongoing eternal Russia investigation. He this week published a couple of stories on the Clinton Foundation. It seems that the chief financial officer of the Clinton Foundation earlier this year, thinking that he was meeting with some old professional acquaintances, you know, just buddies trading war stories about the business of accounting, admitted to investigators that the Clintons' charity, or alleged charity, has a lot of problems with governance, including conflicts of interest. In other words, Bill Clinton commingling his own personal funds with charity funds. The CFO of the Clinton Foundation, Andrew Kessel, talking to investigators from a group called MDA Analytics, LLC. That's a firm run by ex-federal criminal investigators, guys experienced in finding stuff like this, malfeasance. They've been looking into the Clinton Foundation for quite some time. And talking to Kessel, he told MDA Analytics there is no controlling Bill Clinton. He mixes and matches his personal business with that of the foundation. Many people within the foundation have tried to caution him about this, but he doesn't listen, and there really is no talking to him. So these investigators compiled these statements as well as about 6,000 pages of evidence from a whistleblower, which they secretly filed with the FBI and IRS over a year ago. The investigators say the Clinton Foundation engaged in illegal activities and may owe millions in unpaid taxes and penalties. We'll see if anything comes of this, but we also know it's been pretty obvious that Hillary's abuse of her personal email server was in violation of federal law, and nothing's happened to her yet. Now, having said that, the fact that she is not the president, as everyone expected, might give investigators a little more latitude to actually do something, but we shall see. This week, the United States kind of achieved a milestone, something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. I'm old enough to remember the 1973-74 OPEC oil embargo, when there were lines at gas stations and the price of gasoline went from not so much to a whole lot and never really seemed to come back down. The United States last week, believe it or not, became a net oil exporter for the first time in 75 years. Now, again, let me repeat that. For the first time in 75 years, the United States exported oil. We sold more than we brought into the country. Now, I was, 11, 12 years old at the time of the OPEC oil embargo, but ever since then, our dependence on Middle Eastern oil in particular has increased. To the point where in the early 2000s, we were importing more than 12 million barrels a day. And we've been told that, this is just the way it is. The United States is an energy hog, and we just can't produce it here, and so we're just going to have to get used to this idea. We got to play nice with the Middle East because they've got all this oil and we need it. Except that apparently we don't, because last week, for the first time in 75 years, and this is continuing a trend that's been ongoing for about the past decade of decreasing our reliance on imported oil. There's an awful lot of oil under western North Dakota and in the Gulf of Mexico and Texas and Oklahoma and southern Illinois. I knew a bunch of guys in the oil business there from my time as an outside sales rep for a steel company, and they were expecting an oil boom in southern Illinois. The geology there is very similar to what they have in western North Dakota. It's not as cheap to get out of the ground as it is in Saudi Arabia. I've been told that the price of a barrel needs to be around $80 a barrel for drillers to really find it worthwhile to drill new wells. But the point is the oil is there. We may pay a little more for it, but we don't need the Saudis or the Qataris or Kuwait. We really don't. So, and you may remember that it was just a few years ago that a former president, Obama, said that when gasoline hit $4 a gallon, we just can't drill our way out of this problem. Apparently we can. Although, according to new incoming socialist congressperson Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that we really need to shift away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, because renewable energy will help us create economic, social, and racial justice. Racial justice. She said this at a summit hosted by socialist Senator Bernie Sanders. God bless her pointy little head. She just has this idea that it's all sweetness and light and lollipops and rainbows when you're talking about renewable energy. Quoting now, as a matter of fact, it's not just possible that we will create jobs and economic activity by transitioning to renewable energy, but it's inevitable that we are going to create jobs. It's inevitable that we're going to create industry, and it's inevitable that we can use the transition to 100% renewable energy as the vehicle to truly deliver and establish economic, social, and racial justice in the United States of America. End quote. What possible connection can there be between the use of fossil fuels and social injustice, racial injustice? I do not see the connection. Does she even understand what those words mean when you assemble them in that specific order? I mean, they sound nice coming off the tongue, but what do they really mean? In the immortal words of Inigo Montoya, I do not think it means what she thinks it means. When you start throwing around words like this, racial injustice, racism, and connect it to things that have nothing whatsoever to do with how you view another human being, like what you're putting in the gas tank of your car, then the word ceases to have meaning. And we'll talk about that again before the end of this program. A bit of a mystery coming from China. The gene editing doctor, the researcher there in China who claimed that he helped make the world's first genetically edited babies, reportedly missing this week. This was reported on Monday of this week. He Jingqi of Shenzhen, China, who's a researcher at Southern University of Science and Technology in China, was reported missing by the South China Morning Post. Nobody seemed to know his whereabouts. He claimed to have altered the DNA of twins, Lulu and Nana, to try to make them resistant to infection with the AIDS virus. We've talked about this previously. If, in fact, he did genetically edit these young girls, because the CRISPR-Cas9 process is not as precise as researchers would like us to think it is, it's very possible that they will be worse off than if he had not done anything at all. It introduces mutations. They don't know where in the DNA strands exactly or how to control them. So really, they shouldn't be doing this. But the point is, after he made these claims, apparently as of Monday early this week, nobody had seen him for a while. Now, the Harvard Crimson, which is the Harvard University newspaper, reportedly received an email from he, which is his surname, not a pronoun. He reportedly sent an email to the Harvard Crimson in the middle of the week, but that's not a story being reported anywhere else that I could find. And the point is that nobody has reported seeing him. And all the Harvard Crimson can say is this appears to have come from his email account at Shenzhen, or rather at the university there in Shenzhen, Southern University of Science and Technology. They don't know for sure, though. So, curious that this guy who claimed to have created the world's first gene-edited baby, by the way, his claim not documented or confirmed by anybody yet. Not another researcher, not a peer-reviewed journal or anything. So, why would he be missing? University's not talking. They say we can't, comment on this. So, curiouser and curiouser. Well, a lot going on in the world, and again, we've got a full program tonight, so we're going to get right to our interviews here shortly. It is a fact that we in the West are really ignorant of our history, to the point where those who are trying to warn about what we have forgotten are finding it difficult to come up with new ways to say, they really, really do want to kill you. I mean, look, 1,400 years of history. How much more documentation do we need? Scholar of Islamic history Raymond Ibrahim is the author of Sword and Scimitar, and he joins us next on A View from the Bunker.
We've been told that America is a Christian country from its origin, one nation under God. We've been taught that our government is for the people, by the people. But what if it's all been just a grand deception? What if the God, worshipped in secret by government leaders in our nation's capital, is in fact our enemy, and many of our leaders have been venerating him secretly through arcane rituals, setting the scene for the incarnation of this ancient entity?
They used the powerful energy of ninth-degree sex magic, through which the goddess Babylon herself might appear in human form.
What if everything we thought we knew about this great nation was designed to bring about the greatest conspiracy of all time? A conspiracy for the souls of humanity. What if I told you that America was founded by the darkest elite secret societies, and that there are still powerful remnants controlling hands in high positions, carrying this torch? Dr. Thomas Horn, William Ramsey, Russ Dizdar.
It's like God ripped open Hell's Kitchen and said, hey, here's some of the sequence of satanic evolution.
Colonel Robert McGinnis, Wes Fall, Carl Teichrob, Justin Fall.
It is the ritual that would ignite the resurrection of the Antichrist.
Belly of the Beast.
The holidays are rapidly approaching, and now's your chance to save big on the largest TV giveaway of the year. Skywatch TV is proud to announce the Belly of the Beast Grand Giveaway. In the brand new documentary, Belly of the Beast, you'll discover for the first time why a Bible is bound in a magic square inside the testes of the Washington Monument, where and why a buried ancient magical obelisk awaits underground nearby, where the entrance to a secret crypt exists connected to American Lucifer worship from within the deep state, and for the first time ever, the U.S. government-owned location where the Antichrist will be resurrected on American soil. When you order Belly of the Beast from Skywatch TV, you'll also receive Lady Queensborough's celebrated original 1933 Occult Theocracy 2-volume collection beautifully republished by Defender Publishing. These books are classic exposés on the secret societies, from witches to Knights Templar, Freemasons to Rosicrucians, Druids to the Illuminati, Masonic and pagan symbols, Christian Science, the Order of the Jesuits, and so much more. Dr. Thomas Horn says no serious researcher's library is complete without this massive 2-volume collection. These 2 books alone hold a retail value of $80. Yours now, free when you purchase the Belly of the Beast Grand Giveaway. But we're just getting started. You'll also receive a gargantuan supply of brand new, super quality, overstock gift books, DVDs, audio sets, survival and organic living books, and more to add to your library or to give away as gifts this holiday season. Sold separately, this grand giveaway holds a retail value of over $350. Yours now for your donation of only $35 plus shipping and handling. So don't delay. This avalanche of holiday gifts is perfect for the serious researcher in your life, but is only available while supplies last. So take advantage of this, the largest Skywatch TV giveaway of 2018, while you can when you order the Belly of the Beast Grand Giveaway, now at the Skywatch TV store. Order online or call 1-844-750-4985.
Driving the internet to think live every Sunday night. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. We are living in the most prophetic age, the most prophetic time since the 1st century A.D. Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat joins us to discuss the Sanhedrin's ceremony to consecrate the stone altar for the Third Temple. That'll be coming up just over an hour from now. Our guest this week is an author, a speaker. He is a specialist in the Middle East and Islam. He's a fellow at the Middle East Forum and the author of a number of books, including The Al-Qaeda Reader, Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians, and most recently, the brand new book, which has really caught my attention. This is one of the few books that I've actually read all the way through, or had time to read, or made time to read all the way through in the last few months. Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. We're honored to welcome to the program for the first time, Raymond Ibrahim. Raymond, welcome.
Hi, Derek. Thanks for that, and it's great to be with you.
This is a topic that when you start reading a military history, and your book is essentially an analysis of 8 key battles between the forces of Islam and the forces of Christendom, for lack of a better term, you begin to realize that there is a lot more going on today that we as Christians should be paying attention to, that we in the West should be paying attention to. But we seem to have forgotten our history. It's like what was it, Santayana? Those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, exactly. Where based on what we're always being told, by our betters, the establishment, whether it's the media or academia or government politicians, namely that Islam is a religion of peace and all the violence being committed in its name is from criminals and terrorists who have nothing to do with the noble religion of Islam. based on that mantra, which we've been hearing for generations, actually, it's caused people to just not. It's created a discontinuity with the history of the West's history with Islam. Okay, and in fact, something like ISIS or ISIL, or basically the Islamic State, which especially every politician and talking head has gone out of their way to distance from Islam. If you look at their actions, they are an actual perfect mirror duplicate of what 14 centuries of Muslims have been doing in and saying to the West, or mostly Europe in this context. So the beheadings and the mass crucifixions and these sex slave markets, and burning people alive, all that sort of thing that ISIS has committed. When you look at the history as documented, as you mentioned in the book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 centuries, when you look at that history, you're going to find it's something that just completely kept happening over and over and over every century, many times, except on a exponential level. So in other words, whereas ISIS is just one little small group that was located in Syria and Iraq and other areas in that region, what was happening historically is that the great caliphates, the great sultanates of history, the Ottomans and the Seljuks and the Abbasids and the Umayyads and so forth, under the leadership of the supreme head of the Islamic world, the Caliph or the Sultan, depending on the situation, were issuing literally hundreds of thousands of jihadis into Europe, both from the West, through Spain, and from the East and the Balkans and all throughout the Mediterranean, in the same and under the same logic that ISIS used, which is basically, you people, Europeans, Christians, are infidels, and it's our duty to subjugate, kill you, enslave you, etc., until you embrace Islam. So you got that for 14 centuries, unwavering, and yet, as you were pointing out, no one gets that today, and instead we have people seriously saying and being believed by millions that Islam doesn't preach violence, Islam's a religion of peace, etc., etc.
I was reading a popular history of Islam by a best-selling author recently, and it became clear to me, and I'm no expert, that she was making apologies for the way Muhammad chose to spread his religion in the early days. And it struck me that we've been doing this, it seems, in the West for a very long time. I mean, when Muhammad's own words, which you cite right at the beginning of the book, Sword and Scimitar, Muhammad's own words, I have been commanded to wage war against mankind until they testify that there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Why do we not take that seriously?
Because if we take that seriously and if we become fully acquainted with the history that we're discussing, as in Sword and Scimitar and so forth, it completely undermines one of the major bedrocks of Western epistemology, which is basically that Islam is peaceful. And the reason Islam is propped up, I don't think, is because secular forces really care about Islam, but rather that's their way of trying to downgrade Christianity. It's this sort of relativism, multiculturalism, everything is equal, there's nothing better than the other, and so far, if Christianity has any saving grace to it, well, guess what? So does Islam, so does Buddhism, so does Hinduism. This is a pillar today in Western thinking. So I think that's why there's so much ink and resources spent on the propaganda of apologizing for everything that Islam does. And you're right, because there's really no end to the angles that Western apologists for Islam will go to defend it, and the double standards are so obvious. And I'll give you one example of a report I was reading literally right before we started talking about a girl in Germany that was gang raped by 7 Muslim migrants. And when you look into the report, you find out that the German police responded by warning German women that, well, maybe they shouldn't dress promiscuously, maybe they shouldn't drink alcohol and go out alone at night, et cetera, et cetera. All of which, of course, is good advice. But of course, and even feminists are later reported in other articles I accessed after I read that, feminists, academics in Norway and in Austria and in all these Western European nations who once would have told, Western Americans and males and so forth that it's a woman's right to dress any way she wants and she can do anything and she shouldn't be afraid. Now they're telling women, don't do that, dye your hair. If you're blonde, dye it dark. If you're living in an area with a heavy Muslim migrant concentration. So my point is, even in this, the crisis of mass rapes all throughout Europe at the hands of migrants from Muslim nations is being, we have a new apologia for that too. And now it's the Western women's fault for being raped and so forth. So it's definitely a movement that's meant to shield very much and protect Islam.
Oh, brother. Okay. Well, maybe we can get back to that before the end of the end of the conversation. But I do want to dive into the history, which I've always been kind of a history nerd, but never disciplined enough to really study it seriously. And now I'm old enough to where trying to go back to school to study it might not be practical at this point. You chose 8. Well, let me start with Muhammad. His career. Give us a summary. When did he begin to preach Islam, and at what point did he decide to change tactics? And what was the difference between his original approach to evangelizing and when he finally hit on the formula?
The funny thing about Muhammad, in the context of your question, is that his biographers and the early Muslim historians who chronicled his life and the early decades of Islam, were so ingenuous in a sense because they wrote things just as they were without being able to sort of read between the lines and see what it is they're exactly writing and how bad it sounds to a non-Muslim or to basically a person who's thinking rationally. Okay. And so that's just something, I'm just trying to preface what I'll tell you by saying that. Okay. So Muhammad is so transparent because in the beginning and he's born around 570 AD. And, when he's at the age of 40, right around 610 AD, he finally marries Khadija, who's a rich woman, older than him, et cetera, et cetera. And he finally has the resources now to live a life of leisure, which he decides to do by frequenting caves and contemplating. And then one night he gets attacked in this cave by a being, okay, which is arguably a genie, because that's exactly what a jinn, Muhammad thought. Mm-hmm. He was actually attacked and squeezed and then told to recite, which of course is the word where we get the word Quran from, the Arabic word recite. And he ran home frightened. And Khadija, his wife, he told her what happened, and she told him, "Oh no, that's an angel of God. Okay, it's not a demon or anything like that. Don't be afraid. He wants you to be a prophet." And to make a long story short, so this quote unquote angel, this entity, kept giving him concepts and words and ideas to recite. He went to the people of Mecca, which was his tribe, and they were polytheists at the time, and started telling them all this. They need to change their ways, et cetera, et cetera. But he was just preaching. He wasn't violent. And the reason, of course, is because he was the only one. After 10 years of preaching, he had maybe 100 followers, most of whom were part of his extended tribe. Okay. And then finally, the Meccans got tired of his agitating and cursing their gods and so forth. They drove him out, and he left and went to Medina. And then he became a warlord. He had all these people follow him. And then he said, God or Allah has called on us to attack the non-believers, the infidels, the kuffar in Arabic. And they started going on these raids. Okay. And then every time they got more, they won, and they got plunder from the raids. A lot more people came and followed him. And it's interesting because when you look at the sources, none of this ever comes off as people found him as spiritually compelling and they believed he was a prophet. It's always the more he was victorious, the more people followed him and started raiding under his banner. And that was all it was. And he kept growing and growing in numbers and strength, and he became a warlord with God, of course, as the ultimate chief, Allah. And that's the long story. And finally, he dies in 632, according to the traditional Muslim accounts. And the evidence of how much faith Muslims had in him. Right when he died, a humongous chunk of the Arabs broke away and said, "Okay, we're done with this Islam thing. He had a good run, he's gone." And then Abu Bakr, his first, the first caliph or successor, whose 9-year-old daughter Muhammad married, or actually he consummated the marriage when she was 9, but married her when she was 6. He becomes a new leader, and he wages a war on all these people, and literally tens and thousands of Arabs are crucified, burned alive, tortured, just because they wanted to break away from Islam. And this is, of course, will repeat itself throughout history until the present. So that, in a nutshell, is Muhammad's rise to power. But now it has this hagiographical veneer by later Muslim historians. But like I said, if you look at the original sources, And that's what Christians, when they first encountered Islam in the 7th century and the 8th century, this is what they said. They looked at his history, the one that I just delineated, and they said, so what's so special about this guy? Where's his claim that he's a prophet is that he was able to attack, kill, plunder, enslave, and rape people. And that's no claim at all, because anyone, any murderer or warlord thug can do that. But until today, and this is why, by the way, Muslims, you often hear about uprisings and anger because someone, a non-Muslim, a Christian or whatever, blasphemed against Muhammad. The reason is so easy to do that. It's so easy to criticize Muhammad's life, and all the criticism is right there in Muslim sources, Muslim biographies that record all this stuff. And I'll give you another quick example, and we can end it. Muhammad, there's a Quran verse, one of the most scandalous stories that really bothered early Christians, that Arabs and Muslims were taking this man as a prophet, goes like this. Muhammad had a son, an adopted son. Okay, his name is Zayd, and he compelled his cousin, Muhammad's cousin, whose name is Zainab, to marry him, or his adopted son. They got married. She didn't want to. Okay, and then sometime later, he went to visit his adopted son, who he called his son, and he went into his tent, and lo and behold, he saw his wife, Zainab, basically half naked, because she didn't have the whole, paraphernalia on, the hijab, niqab, etc. And all of a sudden, he got attracted to her. So he left. Zayd, his son, noticed the attraction, and he offered to divorce her so Muhammad could marry her. Muhammad said, no, that's not appropriate, and because he was thinking what the Arabs would think, his followers. So lo and behold, a new verse was revealed by Allah that's till this day enshrined in the Quran, basically scolding Muhammad for caring about what people will think, when Allah wanted Muhammad to marry her all along anyway. And so my point is, this stuff is literally recorded there. And early people who were not Muslims, who were not brainwashed, when they saw it, they were scandalized and couldn't believe it. And they would criticize the Prophet of Islam. And until this very day, Muslims have no response, because it is in their sources, but to retaliate with anger and rage and riot and so forth.
So Muhammad rises to power, attracts a lot of followers by basically making it a holy calling to go out and raid and steal stuff from other tribes in Arabia. He dies in 632, and then the first of the 8 battles that you summarize occurs just a few years later, in the year 636. This is the Battle of Yarmouk, and forgive my pronunciation. I'm sure I'm.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So how significant was this battle?
Right. Well, of the 8 battles that I chronicle, in my opinion, Yarmouk was probably the most significant of all the battles, certainly the most decisive.
So even more than the fall of Constantinople.
Oh, yeah. I mean, really, the fall of Constantinople, as traumatic as it was for Eastern Europeans and Greek Christians and so forth, was more symbolic. It was more of a symbolic a victory for Islam and loss for Christendom than anything else, because Constantinople was just surrounded by a sea of Islam at the time. All of the Balkans were already conquered by the Ottomans, but the holdout that was surrounded by this sea of Islam was Constantinople. So it didn't really, the conquest of Constantinople had a massive symbolic demoralization effect on the Christian world, the Eastern one especially, but it didn't really have that of a practical, decisive effect on outcomes, on the outcome or the subsequent outcomes after that. Okay. But Yarmouk is the exact opposite. Yarmouk is one of these battles that virtually no one in the West has even heard of.
Right.
But it happens in the year 636, and historians who have studied it, well-known historians, I quote a couple in the book, they describe it as the most consequential battle of all world history. So not even just between Islam and Europe, but really all of world history. And the reason for that is after the Arabs crushed the Eastern Roman Empire's army, or the Byzantine Empire's armies by the river Yarmouk in Syria in 636, that essentially opened the floodgates for all the subsequent conquests, because the Byzantine Empire had marshaled up a massive army, and this was supposed to be it. This was supposed to be the decisive stroke that sends the Arabs reeling back to the peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, and they failed. And after that, basically in a couple of years, they swept westward from Syria, and they took Egypt in a couple of years, and then in another decade or so, Libya was taken, to give it its modern-day name, and then in the following decades, all of North Africa into Spain. So basically, from Yarmouk, in less than a century after Yarmouk, and largely because of that loss, all of the Middle East, Syria, Greater Syria, which really encompassed Palestine, Lebanon, all these areas, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, into Spain were conquered because they couldn't be held back at that point. And what's more important is it wasn't just a conquest, a lot of times, for example, the Germanic conquerors behind the fall of Rome in the 5th century and so forth, they came and they conquered, but they were actually later assimilated into Roman culture, which at the time was Christian, and they learned the Latin alphabet, and they basically were assimilated into that. What happened to North Africa and Syria was the exact opposite. Not only were they conquered, but the conquerors imposed their language, their religion, Islam, the language Arabic, and the culture onto all those peoples. And so the result is today, whereas Arabians, Arabs, and Arabia was once confined to the Arabian Peninsula, the language, the culture, the people. Today, when we say the Arab world, we're talking 22 countries, none of which were Arab to begin with. So Egypt and Syria had their own languages, Coptic, which is a descendant of Pharaonic for Egypt, and, Syriac and all the other variants of that language in Syria. And, of course, the Berbers in North Africa and so forth. So you had all these different peoples, most of whom were very much Christian. So in the 7th century, if you took, and this is the other pivotal point about the Battle of Yarmouk, in the 7th century when this battle happened, if you took all the territory that made up what we call Christendom, or the Christian world, okay, which was then all of North Africa, Southwest Asia, and southwest of the Danube-Rhine rivers, all of that was Christian. After Yarmouk, and within that few decades, or definitely less than a century, more than 3/4 of that Christian original territory was forever conquered in the name of Islam. And so it's sort of ironic for me to hear today, for example, when I talk about Christian remnants in the Middle East who are being persecuted by Muslims in Egypt, in Syria, and elsewhere, and people will tell me, we sympathize, but why did Christians go live in Muslim lands to start with? And it just, it shows you the ignorance of the fact that actually Islam truncated Western history, truncated Western civilization big time with these conquests, and that today all these nations that we just think of as Arab and Muslim and so forth were actually part of the continuity of Western Christian history. At the time of the 7th century, the heart of the Christian world, the heart of civilization, was in those areas that are today conquered by Islam, including Alexandria in Egypt, Damascus and Antioch in Syria, Constantinople, of course, modern-day Turkey. You had 5 Christian centers, 5 sees historically. Only one of them today is still Christian, Rome. All the other 4 were conquered permanently. So it's a bit ironic, and it goes again to show you the divorce in history in the modern Western mentality that no one, very few people understand or know this. And they just think Islam was always there. That area was always Arabic speaking, and it was always Muslim, which is not the case, of course.
We're talking with Raymond Ibrahim about his book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West on a View from the Bunker. How is it possible, Raymond, that these armies coming out of Arabia, which was not a wealthy place. I mean, you can't really grow stuff there. I mean, you had the spice trade coming up the east side of the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, which, the Nabatean kingdom made them wealthy. The Romans, when they took it, inherited that money-making venture. But still, it's not really a place where you got a lot of natural resources like we're blessed with here in the United States. How is it that they were able to overwhelm the remnant of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, in the first place?
Well, that's a good question, and it's, for modern academics, it's definitely a conundrum because, like you said, they shouldn't have won. They were under-equipped. They didn't have military strategies the way the Byzantine Empire did, or for that matter, the neighboring Sasanian Persian Empire, and yet they won. And modern historians are in a pickle trying to explain it, and the reason for that is because they can only, in their framework, they can only resort to material explanations.
Okay.
Right? And materially, all the enemies of Islam or their opponents, the Byzantines and the Persians, were materially stronger. But explaining this away was never a problem either for Muslim historians or Christian/European historians up until very recently. And Muslim historians actually explained it by saying that, the Muslim fighters, the jihadis, or as they're known in Arabic, the mujahideen, were basically inflamed to no end because they were offered a win-win scenario, as I refer to it in the book, actually. The first scenario is you fight, you conquer, you get plunder and booty and slaves, okay? And the second scenario is you fight, but you don't conquer, and you get killed. And then guess what? You get booty and plunder and slaves in heaven, in perpetuity, for heaven, for eternity. And, that might sound flippant, but the reality is the Islamic notion of paradise is inherently carnal. It discusses, men having carnal relations with supernatural celestial women who are made by Allah expressly for sexual purposes to prolong and heighten the pleasure. And I mean, this is written in their books. Little boys are also circulated around, and that's in the Quran. A reference to pedophilia. They'll have gold and jewels. There'll be a lot of eating and gorging, and they'll be able to drink from rivers of wine, even though they're not supposed to drink alcohol now. And today a lot of people will hear that and will dismiss it as silly. But the fact is 7th century Arabs believed that passionately until until now. When you read Islamic terrorists from the Islamic State and so forth, Al-Qaeda, and you delve into their own discussions, often in Arabic, as I do. This isn't usually sent to the West or translated because it has no value, but online I've heard and I've read about how they often talk about these things in the now, as if that's still going to happen and they expect to be rewarded in paradise with unlimited, gorging on food and, sex with supernatural women and so forth. Now, if you move up until recently, even in the 1900s, I quote in the book, in Sword and Scimitar, a British general, I think his name is Glubb, who actually went to Arabia, in the early 1900s and fought. And afterwards, he said, I can tell you, as a person who actually commanded Arabic Muslim battalions, that these people truly believe all this stuff, and they will go fighting to the end and die because they expect to go and be rewarded with sex slaves in heaven and so forth. And if they don't die, like I said, it's a win-win. Then they get that sort of thing here in the now. And I think that is the most plausible explanation as to why an inherently and materially weak and economically weak Islamic Arab armies were able to overcome their counterparts in the West and so forth, because they had that edge that made them very fanatical, and we still see that edge today. When a young man goes and blows himself up just to kill people in a church, and he's convinced that in doing so he's going to go and be rewarded in paradise.
And there's no the other factor that isn't considered by modern Western historians, especially, is the theology that the Apostle Paul put very succinctly in his letter to the church at Ephesus. We're not wrestling against human opponents, but against principalities and powers and cosmic rulers over this present darkness. There's a spiritual aspect to this that we cannot really quantify because we don't see into that realm, but I suspect that had something to do with this as well.
Well, just to add to that, I'll tell you this, and this is copiously documented in the book, in Sword and Scimitar, but for early Christians who confronted and dealt with Islam, they had no doubt, and by early, I mean, from the 7th century, including people like John of Damascus, up until recently, up until the postmodern era, they were convinced that Muhammad was possessed diabolically, and that Islam was the religion of the beast, and that everything about it was set about to destroy the kingdom of God in the now on earth and to attack, Christendom. So this was the default position for Christians all throughout Europe, from the 7th century up until, the 1700s or the Enlightenment era and so forth. No one had any doubt about that. And again, they would cite Islamic scriptures, including Muhammad being attacked by what he thought was a jinn, and basically going into seizures and foaming at the mouth and falling down before a revelation came to him, up until the fact that from the start, Muslim armies would always have an abhorrence for Christian symbols. and would destroy crosses, urinate on them, defecate on them. This comes out in the history, burn churches, just like we see today. So that's been going on for a long time. And for a lot of these early Christians, they were convinced that Satan was actually behind the religion of Islam.
Well, I can't say that I would argue with that assessment, but it is amazing how far we have come in the Western world from that point of view. Let's skip ahead. You deal with the first siege of Constantinople, which was a setback for Islam, but I want to set that aside because coming to the Battle of Tours, I think it's really shocking for us in the West who've forgotten all of this history. How much of an impact Islam had even on Western Europe until relatively recently in our history. But within 100 years, this is what I find astonishing. Within 100 years of the death of Muhammad, not only had Spain been overrun, but the forces of Islam had basically taken the Mediterranean coast of France and were making inroads into France. And it took Charles Martel to turn back Islam at Tours. How did Islam get that far, and what did Martel do that was different from what the Visigoths in Spain had done?
Yeah, those are good questions. So in the year 711, Islam had conquered the whole of North Africa, as we were discussing, post the Battle of Yarmouk in 632, and then they invaded into Spain. And at this point, you still had an Arabic core at the center of the army, but it was also, you had a lot of Berbers, North Africans, who had become Islamicized at this point. Because the Berbers, if you look into their history, and I talk about this in chapter 1, but they fought pretty fiercely for their freedom against Islam. But in the end, they just converted and they all became Muslims. It was a sort of, if you can't beat them, join them mentality, because the Berbers themselves were very tribal and they engaged in the sorts of things that Islam, had deified, which is basically warfare on the other, who's not one of us, and, enslavement, plunder, and so forth. But so this vast host of Berbers and Muslims and Arabs went into Spain. It eventually collapsed very quickly after one of the battles at a river, Guadalete River in the south. And it was run by the Visigoths, basically the Western Goths, who were Christian at the time. And the reason why they collapsed so fast, varies. Some people say there was dissensions within the Visigothic army, which is very plausible. And other reasons come up. But then when they went in after that, they kept moving northward and they crossed into, like you were saying, into France, and they had basically the coasts of all of France conquered, and the atrocities, you should see them. And, I record them in Sword and Scimitar, but a lot of other, earlier primary sources record them, and I quote from them. And it was just, mass slaughter, mass enslavement, destruction of churches, plundering of churches, the usual. And basically, at this point, by the year 732, under the leadership of Abdul Rahman, an Arab Muslim, they were making, it says, about 80,000 strong army started heading towards Tours to plunder the basilica of the saint of the same name. And it was supposed to be one of the richest shrines full of gold and so forth. And that's where they were headed. And finally, Charles, the Hammer, quote unquote, Martel, and that's where the title Martel comes from. He was essentially the king at the time. They call him the mayor of the palace, but he was a king. And he finally rallied a lot of his men, and they went and they met, and they had the Battle of Tours in the year 732, which ironically is the year Muhammad died. So we're talking only 1 century after the death of Muhammad. And as I was saying, 3/4 of the Christian world is now conquered, and Islam is in the heart of Europe, right in the heart of France.
Yeah, Tours is not on the coast. I mean, Tours is about 2/3 of the way. If you're going, from south to north, it's about 2/3 of the way to the British Channel, the English Channel.
Yeah, and they had a very bloody battle, which is recounted in detail in the book. And eventually, after just one day of hard fighting, the Franks prevailed. And the Muslims just fled back south behind the mountain chain border between Iberia and the mainland Europe, France, and then they stayed, of course, there. We can talk about that later for centuries in Spain. But, the decisiveness and the importance of that battle was always well known historically. And even someone like Edward Gibbon, who's, decidedly secular, and you can tell he's very anti-church, anti-Christianity, said that had Charles Martel and the Franks not been able to withstand the Muslims, meaning we here in England, would be reciting the Quran in Oxford University. And, today when you hear that, it sounds funny and people don't believe it. But the reality, like I said, it really comes to you when you realize that countries like Egypt and Syria and Turkey and Libya and all these places were actually more Christian than Europe. And look at them today. Today, no one even thinks of them as having any Christian background. So what would have stopped that from happening in England, if Charles Martel and his men didn't prevail? Because they were the supreme military force of Europe at the time, the Franks, the Frankish Empire. And if they would have also folded under the force of Islam, there's no reason to believe any other West European element would have able to withstand the Muslim juggernaut.
You think about that and realize that, again, Tours in France is not near the coast. Islam was halfway to making it to the English Channel, and the core of Europe was under threat from Islamic armies for about the next 900 years. Think about that. 732 AD, Charles Martel turned the Muslims back at Tours, and the final battle inside Europe with the forces of Islam, major battle, took place after some of my ancestors are already on this new continent called North America. Our conversation is going to continue. How important to Western history was Charles the Hammer, Charles Martel, and how did Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation almost turn Europe Muslim? Raymond Ibrahim is our guest. His new book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. And our conversation continues next on A View from the Bunker. Cutting-edge analysis of end-times prophecy on the very ground where it all unfolds. It's the Skywatch TV Wars of the Gods Tour of Israel, May 12th through 23rd, 2019, hosted by Derek and Sharon Gilbert, and Pastor Carl Gallups, best-selling author of Gods and Thrones and Gods of Ground Zero, Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat of Messiah of Israel Ministries, and filmmakers Justin and Wes Fall, producers of the Hollow Earth Chronicles. This is a once-in-a-lifetime tour of the Holy Land from Mount Hermon to the Dead Sea. You'll walk in Jesus' footsteps on the battlegrounds of the supernatural war with preaching and teaching along the way. Shiloh, Bethel, Mount Carmel, Nazareth, the Jordan River, the Mount of Olives, Sea of Galilee, the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jerusalem, where the final battle will be fought for God's Mount of Assembly, Zion. The Skywatch TV Wars of the Gods Tour of Israel. Reserve your place now. For information and registration, log on to lipkintours.com. That's lipkintours.com.
Jack the Ripper's dark deeds actually began long before 1888. And it wasn't a mere man who committed the crimes, but a demon in league with devilish men, a group of men called Red Wing. Only one small group of valiant men and women stand against this evil, a group that place their faith in Christ alone. And they protect a secret of blood that Red Wing hopes to use to usher in the reign of Antichrist and the end of day.
Red Wing is called Red Wing because they want to kill the church. They want to forever stop Christ from coming back. So it's the Holy Spirit, the dove, with a murdered, has been slain, a wounded dove. Ultimately, we still have to remember that the one who is in control is God Almighty, and we have to go to Him, and we have to suit up every time we go out.
The Red Wing Saga by Sharon K. Gilbert. Book 1. Blood Lies. Book 2. Blood Rights. Book 3. The Blood is the Life. Book 4. Realms of Stone. And coming soon, Book 5. Realms of Fire. Available at skywatchtvstore.com and paperback and Kindle at amazon.com. Characters you'll love and a story you can't put down. The Red Wing Saga by Sharon K. Gilbert. One man, one microphone, and a psychological need to tell the world what he thinks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. We are living in the most prophetic time since the first century. So says our friend Pastor Carl Gallups, and we agree. Coming up in our final segment tonight, in just about 30 minutes, we will talk about the Sanhedrin. It is back together. They've got the band back together. And tomorrow, they're holding a consecration ceremony for the stone altar for the Third Temple. That's coming up in our final segment tonight with the messianic Rabbi Zev Porat, an interview recorded earlier this week via Skype from Tel Aviv. But now we return our guest, Raymond Ibrahim, author of the new book, Sword and Scimitar. So how long of a setback did the Franks and Charles Martel set the Islamic world? I mean, there was a point somewhere after the 8th century where Arabs no longer led the charge of Islam against the West. Did the Franks had something to do with that, or was there something else that occurred there that kind of transferred the leadership of the Islamic world from the Arabs to the Turks?
Well, basically the Islamic Empire, and the first one really is the Umayyad. It's known as the Umayyad Empire, which reigned sometime from like 661 AD till about 750. So that's when most of the conquests take place that we're discussing. It was a predatory caliphate, which means all of its wealth consisted entirely on plunder of both, animate and inanimate objects. Animate, of course, being human slaves. And they got this through that long march all throughout North Africa, into Spain and into France. Now, once that halted up in France and Islam was now confined in Spain and basically North Africa, and they couldn't get any further than the walls of Constantinople in the east. We can talk about that later. Basically, in the 8th and 9th century, what you had, and this is a very little-known epic, is a massive piratical Islamic jihad raids throughout the Mediterranean. Okay, and all the European nations, Italy, and all the coasts, Balkans and Greece and so forth, were continuously bombarded, and all the islands, Crete and Sardinia and Sicily and all these and Malta were all actually occupied. And it's unknown how many Europeans were enslaved, but it was countless. The Arabs actually, after tours, they actually managed to get into Switzerland and had a base in Switzerland.
Wow!
From which they would send out slave raiding parties to capture white Europeans and send them and sell them in North Africa. So that's a little known aspect of history, and numbers are very hard to find. But it was a continuous, constant bombardment. And then finally, as you were saying, it starts fizzling out, and you have a new caliphate that comes, the Abbasids, who's a little more Persian than they are Arabic. And, there's more of a consolidation in the Islamic Empire, and there's something of a reprieve for Europe. Constantinople, as the arch enemy, still gets attacked annually, twice every year and so forth as required. But eventually, you now have a move from the Arabs to the Turks. So the Turks are originally brought as slave soldiers, and a lot of these Arab or Muslim empires were completely run by or were completely supported by slave soldiers who were brought in, Islamized, brainwashed, indoctrinated, and turned into jihadis, and then let loose against Islam's enemies. So really, if you want to talk about it, the pivotal battle I discussed, the fourth battle at the hands of the Turks, is the Battle of Manzikert. Yeah, which happens in the year 1071, and it's pivotal because now you got these Turks under the Seljuk Empire, and Seljuk is just the name of one of their forefathers, and they're all Muslim, they're all pious, at least according to Islamic records. They all invade Eastern Europe in the context of jihad, giving Christians three choices: convert, pay jizya, tribute, or live or war. And then they finally defeat the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 at the hands of Alp Arslan, who's known as, which means, it's a Turkish title, which means a courageous lion, but I call him Muhammad because his real name was Muhammad, and it's important to keep in mind, the roots of the conflict. So he's victorious. The first Roman emperor in over 1,000 years is actually taken captive during this battle, Romanus Diogenes. And it's a very interesting battle, actually, when you look at it and all the machinations involved and treachery, et cetera, et cetera. But underneath all that, you have the like I said, the usual divide. You're an infidel. this is Islam, we're coming to take your nation, you have three choices, etc., etc. After this battle, all of Anatolia, which is still a part of the Christian world, and especially the Byzantine Empire, Anatolia being modern-day Turkey, was conquered by the Seljuks, and it brought them all the way up to Constantinople, just 2,500 feet away. And what's important about that battle is, the rise of the Turks, because now they become the new standard bearers of Islam. The Arabs, the Persians, they kind of go on the retreat. Arabic is the language of Islam and so forth. But the new fighters and new jihadis are always now Turks or under the leadership of Turks. And, really the most important aspect for our purposes about this Battle of Manzikert is after that battle in 1071, as I was saying, they conquered the whole of Anatolia. According to the primary sources, hundreds of thousands of Christians living in Anatolia were butchered and slaughtered. Thousands of churches were set aflame, and hundreds of thousands of more Christians were enslaved and sent into Eastern slavery. And that right there is the reason why the Crusades, which is the next chapter in Sword and Scimitar, happened. Because the Byzantine Emperor Alexius, seeing what was going on and just how threatened his entire empire was and what was happening to his people, implored the Pope, Pope Urban II, for aid, and telling him, if you don't help us, next they're going to be coming for you, because we're the Eastern bulwark of the Christian world. And that was the reason of the Crusades. That's why it happened when it happened. And yet today, when you listen to all these apologists that we were mentioning earlier, they present the Crusades in a vacuum. They don't tell you that Muslims were butchering Christians left and right, hundreds of thousands of them. They present it as if people like John Esposito, academic from Georgetown, and I quote him in the book, he says something like, 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence passed until, imperial popes and greedy knights came up with a pretext to go and colonize the Islamic world. You see, so this is that great disconnect that we're talking about between what really happened, which sheds light on what's happening today, and the lies that just proliferate both about the past and the present.
It is astonishing. And you mentioned 2,500 feet away. Now, is that correct? Because Constantinople was on the west side of the strait there, and the Turks...
Yeah, 2,500 feet away from the narrowest point of the strait.
Okay. And so the Turks had basically taken all of Anatolia, ancient Asia Minor, and then left the Byzantines just holding the western side, the side closest to Greece. Okay. So Pope Urban then puts out a call, and because you're right, Raymond, it does seem that, and again, as somebody who's had an interest in history, and maybe not this period of history, but what little I've read always seems to paint the Crusades as wars of conquest, and they went slaughtering and pillaging, and they just indiscriminately killed these poor Muslims and Jews in every city they came to, is kind of the impression that I was left with. But in reading your book, Sword and Scimitar, I get a very different picture, and a very different justification for the call to war by the men of the West.
Well, see, and that's exactly it. In the book, in Sword and Scimitar, as we were saying, there's 8 battles that I focus on. In reality, the Crusades, all of them, pale in significance to any of these battles. And yet, we know and we've heard about the Crusades repeatedly, even though we haven't heard of so many of these battles, like Yarmouk, as I was saying, and so forth. And the question is, well, why are the Crusades so famous in the West, whereas all these other important battles, much more important battles that I delineate in the book, a lot of them aren't even known? And the reason is because the Crusades is the only battle where you actually have Christians and Europeans marching onto Muslim land. And so, de facto, they can instantly be made to look like the aggressors, the bad guys, the violent ones. Okay, so whereas all the other battles that I discuss, you have Muslims marching into European territory, which is hard for the apologists to explain away, what's bringing Muslims into Constantinople, what's bringing them into France and Spain and so forth. In a superficial sense, they can present the Crusades as, oh, well, look, the Christians, left Europe and entered Muslim land and created atrocities. And so on the surface and within a vacuum, it looks like the Crusaders are the bad guys. And I believe that is the main reason why the Crusades are so famous, are so well known, as opposed to these much more important encounters, military encounters, between Muslims and Christians that had massive, and the Crusades didn't even have a decisive impact on this history that I'm discussing. They basically managed to take Jerusalem and all these other cities along the coast, Eastern Mediterranean, for a century or two, and then they just lost them back to Islam, which had them. So it didn't even change the status quo at all. But they're famous because they're fodder to be used against Western civilization, against Christianity, and so forth. And say, as Barack Hussein Obama once did, who are we to judge, and don't get on your high horse and start talking about what Muslims are doing, because remember what people did in the Crusades and so forth. I honestly think that's the main reason Crusades are still so popular.
We're talking with Raymond Ibrahim about his book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West on a View from the Bunker. One of the things that comes out in your book, and I know we're going to skip over some of the battles here probably, but that's okay, because I would like people to get your book and read it, because it's eye-opening. One of the themes that comes through is the disunity, and you mentioned this a bit in relation to the Battle of Manzikert, but it shows up again and again, how the disunity amongst Western Christians. These nobles are jealous of this guy because he might become too powerful and get above his raisin, or this guy, the French go into battle first because they don't like the Hungarians, or whatever. How much of a role, how important was that in the West's inability to stand up to Islam over these centuries?
It was definitely a role. It's hard to say, how important of a role. It was definitely, I would put it as, one of the big five roles, at least, that contributed. And it got a lot worse in more recent times. So it wasn't as bad, in the 7th and 8th century as it was in the 15th and 16th centuries, for example. And a lot of that had to do, had to do with the schisms. Okay, so first, of course, you have the Catholic Orthodox schism. And then, you have Catholics sacking Constantinople in 1204 and so forth, which, by the way, is kind of an exaggerated also account, which a lot of historians have discussed. You can look into, Thomas Madden has written about it, the whys and the who and how it happened. It's as you can imagine, the Catholic Crusader sack of Constantinople is one of the favorite themes of the apologists for Islam. But a lot of it is really distorted and exaggerated. But anyway, so you definitely have that, and there was animosities because of that and so forth. So when Constantinople was being attacked by Islam, Catholics and Orthodox, Catholics, a lot of Catholics came to help, actually. But, other Catholics wouldn't, and the Orthodox themselves didn't want the help of Catholics. So you definitely had that there. But it really reached a high point, I think, with the Protestant Reformation, with Martin Luther, and that comes out in the book a lot.
Yeah, that was something I had never considered, and it just kind of pointed out to me how skewed my view of history is, because I had never considered the possibility that Martin Luther, as you mentioned in the book, Sword and Scimitar, basically nailed his theses on the Württemberg door at the worst possible time, because it divided Christendom at a point when Islam and the Ottoman Empire was getting ready to launch a major assault right into the heart of Europe.
Right. And he actually told his followers, don't help the Catholics against the Turks, because what are the Turks doing but, filling heaven with real Christians? If the Catholics they kill are real Christians, and if they're not, well, that's God's judgment to kill them. And he really took a very passive position towards Islam, and one that we can arguably say was somewhat favorable. Don't get me wrong, he still, like most Christians, saw Islam as a false religion and Muhammad as the beast and the Antichrist and all that. But it's interesting because, my enemy, or the enemy of my enemy, is my friend. And that principle was very much on display in the whole Protestant Catholic schism. Because at that time in the 1500s with Martin Luther, you have the Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic Empire, and so forth, fighting against the Turks. And north of that, you have the Protestant Revolution in Germany and so forth. So really, in the southeast, you got Islam, and in the northwest, you got the Protestants, and in the middle, you got the Catholics. And a lot of the propaganda that came out from the Protestants was so anti-Catholic that it basically, in order to make Catholics look good, it had to apologize for Islam and portray Islam and Muslims almost as the good guys. And it's interesting because this sort of relativism and kind of, citing Catholic atrocities to minimize, what Islam is doing is with us till this day.
Oh, yeah.
And it started then. And I also find it kind of interesting that it's especially well ingrained in historically Protestant nations. Okay, because if you look today at Europe or the West in general, which nations have this sort of naive appreciation and outlook about Islam? It's really historically Protestant nations. Northwest Europe, Scandinavia,
right.
Britain, Germany. The United States to a lesser extent, Australia. You don't see this sort of thing in Eastern Europe, okay, which is mostly Orthodox and also Catholic.
Right.
So I think this thing had this sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend has spilled over up until today. And it's one of the chief reasons that we still, in the collective consciousness of the Western nations, Islam is kind of the good guy because the real bad guy is the Catholics.
I've noticed in the news that the president of Hungary, is it Orban? He seems to be a little out of step with the welcoming attitude of Merkel and Macron when it comes to these so-called refugees that have been flooding into Europe over the last couple of years. And after reading what they went through, what Hungary has been through in its history, it's easier to understand now why he's got a different approach to this problem than the Germans, the Swedes, the Norwegians, and so forth. And by the way, as I have some Swedish ancestry, ancestors who only came over in the 19th century from Sweden, in fact, I was a little shocked to learn that the Vikings and the raids of the Vikings were motivated by the demand for European slaves from the Islamic world.
Well, see, when one really pries into the true history of Islam, especially vis-a-vis the West and Europe and Christendom, as opposed to, I have no other way to call it, but the lies being propagated, including from schools and universities, you find out just how integral Islam was to the bombardment of the Christian world in the medieval era. So as you're saying, any student who studies the 9th century especially will be told, Europe was attacked by 3 different invaders. From the south came the Moors, by which they mean the Muslims. From the east came, these various Turkic tribes, and from the north came the Vikings. Well, you come to find out that when you look at the treasure hoards of the Vikings all throughout Scandinavia, they're just littered with Arabic gold coins.
Wow.
So what is it that Vikings had to offer to the Arab world? Well, it was actually white slaves that they took from Britain and Ireland and all throughout the European coast. That's actually why there was this massive slave raids that went on. It wasn't so much for the Vikings themselves, but it was because they would take it and they would go down the Russian river. I'm forgetting, is it the Volga, and go to the Black Sea, where Muslims for long had slave markets there, and they would sell all these hundreds of thousands of slaves and get tons and tons of gold. That's the only thing that the Muslim worlds were buying from them. The secondary thing they bought from them was things like furs. And so when you read the apologetic accounts, they always say, the Vikings sold slaves and furs to the Muslims, though it's hard to imagine that the furs was really that much. It's a lot harder to capture a fox than it is to capture a lot of, humans in a church. Okay. So for sure, some historians argue that if it wasn't for the Muslim demand for white-skinned slaves, the entire Viking phenomena would not even have happened.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, again, there are many more questions I want to pose to you here, but want to be sensitive of your time, and again, want to leave something for readers to dig into when they get the book Sword and Scimitar. The Siege of Vienna in 1683. This is something else that really astonishes me, because when you look at a map, first of all, you realize that Vienna is not really near southern Europe. It's really way up there. I mean, it's like in the middle of Europe. And this was the second time that the forces of Islam had besieged Vienna, trying to take that city, because it was essentially a gateway to the rest of Europe. You go north, you got Poland and Germany, and you go south, you got Italy, and a pathway through to France. And 1683. I mean, 1683, I've got ancestors on my father's side that had been in this country long enough to have 2 generations of kids by the time the Muslims were at the gates of Vienna in 1683. How close were they to actually taking Vienna?
Well, they were very close, but I mean, more to the point. 1683, we are now well over 1,000 years of Islamic jihads on Christian Europe. And in 1683, the largest Islamic army came. It was reportedly, according to the sources, and this is a conservative estimate because some sources give even more, but 300,000 people came under the Ottoman command and encircled Vienna. And once again, it was the same story. They had 3 choices: convert to Islam, pay jizya, live as tributaries, and so forth, or fight to the death. That death almost came because Vienna was besieged for almost 2 months, and so many people inside the city were dying from plague and dysentery and just starvation, until finally the relief forces led under the Polish king John Sobieski came, and they had a very massive decisive decisive battle on September 12th, which just defeated the Muslims, and not only did they defeat them and the Muslims left, but that really is the turning point. That's the 8th of the big battles that I discuss, because after that, the Ottomans, who had been a scourge to Eastern Europe for centuries, started slowly retreating from all their holdings, including the Balkans and so forth. But it's important to keep in mind that while I discuss in Sword and Scimitar the major battles, I also talk about a few of the little smaller ones.
Right.
And so let's move it. We can cap it off now with talking about the United States and its first encounter with Islam. Okay, and it actually happened before the United States had time to even vote for its first president. So right after the United States, declared independence and broke away from Great Britain, once it broke away from Great Britain, it was no longer protected by Great Britain's jizya payments to the Muslim Barbary pirates in North Africa.
Explain that word jizya for people not familiar.
I will. So basically, according to Islamic doctrine, teaching, and terminology, jizya is if you're a non-Muslim and you wish to live in peace and not be killed, but also live according to second-class citizenship. If you are literally living under Islamic rule, you have to pay what's called jizya, and this is founded on Quran Surah 9, verse 929, and it's extortion money. If you pay X amount of money, however much is demanded from you, you're free to be a Christian, a Jew, whatever, and we won't kill you, is the mentality. And so you had all these pirates all throughout North Africa were just attacking any ship they could find that was Christian from Europe in the Mediterranean, anything that came in the Mediterranean. And by the way, we always hear about slavery and, Europe and racism and we should, but it needs to be balanced by understanding that in the 15, 16, 1700s, Muslims in the Mediterranean and also up in the Crimea, which were attacking the Slavic peoples, enslaved something like 6 million people just in those 2-3 centuries. 6 million people. Christian Europeans.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
And so when America declared independence, Britain was paying jizya, was paying tribute to these northern pirates, North African pirates. And once America broke away, it was no longer covered because it was no longer part of Great Britain. And once the Muslims knew that, they started attacking American vessels, enslaving them, parading them through the streets of Algiers and so forth, killing them, torturing them. And finally, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, these two men who are the product of the Enlightenment and who had never heard of something called Islam, met with the ambassador of Tripoli to try to release, the remaining soldiers or sailors. And they asked him, why are you doing this? What have we done? We haven't done anything to your people. We haven't provoked war, et cetera, et cetera. And it's in the book, the full quote. It's in Sword and Scimitar. But the ambassador replies and says, according to our prophet and our holy book, the Quran, anyone who doesn't believe in Allah is our enemy, and we can kill them, enslave them, rape them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's funny to me, someone like Jefferson and Adams, who wrote the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, and we're talking about, the innate freedom of humanity, what they must have thought to hear this kind of backwards talk. But that's your first actual, and then war was eventually, if you've heard of the Barbary Wars,
right.
I discuss them in the book, That's what the origins of the Barbary Wars were. And they went in American navies. The Navy was actually founded specifically to go and fight these Muslim North African states.
Yeah.
And that's the founding of the American Navy right there. And so to cap it all off, here we've talked now almost 14 centuries of nonstop warfare, all of which is identified, articulated the way ISIS, the Islamic State, articulates it, which is your infidels, blah, blah, blah. We have three choices to kill you, etc. And yet here we are, such is the ignorance, such is the discontinuity in knowledge, that we're sitting around talking about, why do they hate us? What are they doing? Why is this happening? Et cetera, et cetera. And that just shows you how utterly ignorant, people in the West have become, and I think intentionally so. This is designed, this hidden history, so people can, adopt all these other policies like, open door migration for Muslims and so forth. But it's going on, and it's an old story, and it's still repeating itself. And anyone who still doesn't get it needs to really educate themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I read recently, which struck me as just the height of irony regarding the Enlightenment, was the opinion of a scholar that the Greek philosophy on which the Enlightenment, that kind of sparked the Enlightenment, was kept out of Western Europe because it was too dangerous to get from Constantinople to the courts of Western Europe until the fall of Constantinople. And these refugees from the fall of basically brought their books with them, and suddenly, oh, hey, wow, this is a great idea. And that Enlightenment has led to the endowing of the Western world and our oblivious, our complete obliviousness to the threat of Islam today.
Right. Well, the Enlightenment, and if you trace it to its earlier origins, the Renaissance, which starts in Italy, it starts coincidentally enough, right, when all these aristocratic Greeks flee Constantinople after the sack, and they go to Italy, and they bring with them all this new knowledge. But of course, Enlightenment and Renaissance, a la 16th century, via 16th century is not Enlightenment today. Okay, I mean, today it's postmodernism, relativism, whatever. So, the former Enlightenment, it had its merits for sure. But of course, as usual, it's sort of metastasized into something that's rather ill.
What role did the Janissaries play in the spread of Islam? And what were the Janissaries?
Well, the Janissaries to me are, recorded history's first Stockholm Syndrome victims. Mm-hmm. And what they were was basically the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, after they would conquer any this or that particular Balkan region, they would place a levy on it, whereby families didn't have to pay. Remember the jizya, the tribute, the money. Now it had to be paid in their own flesh, in their own sons. So basically, the Turks would go to all these Christian cities and take the healthiest, the handsomest, the strongest, the smartest boys, take them back home, forcefully convert them to Islam, indoctrinate them in jihad, and then raise them in a very Spartan, agoge type system where they would just be deprived food and beaten and disciplined, and it was very harsh and austere. And they would, in the end, if they survived it, they would actually emerge as the most ferocious jihadi of history. And then they would take them, irony of ironies, and unloose them on their former family. And then they would perpetuate this cycle, because these Janissaries, these former Christian boys, would go and conquer, this or that Christian regions, and then it would start all over again. And they would go and seize X amount of Christian boys and reconvert them. So it also had a demographic jihadi aspect to it. And, and here we go again, if you want to hear about the apologetics, because how do Western academics justify this system of basically abducting boys? Many of them were, by the way, raped and sexually, basically sodomized and all sorts of things. And this comes out repeatedly in the sources and in Sword and Scimitar and documented. But it was a very horrible thing. And women, the moms would be crying, holding onto their sons. Some of the fathers would protest and get killed. But today, academics portray this Janissary system as basically the equivalent of a medieval Harvard scholarship. Why? Because the boys that would be taken would leave, their poor peasant families behind, and then they would be raised in this, powerful Ottoman Empire, and they would raise, they would go up to the top and be very rich and prosperous and, respected warlords. And that's how it's being presented today in colleges.
Oh, my goodness. Raymond Ibrahim is the author of the book Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. Raymond, if you had to pick one of the heroes of the West that you characterize or that you profile in your book as somebody that we could really, really use today, who might that be?
There's actually quite a few in the book, because you had a lot of sober-minded thinkers, and of course things like political correctness and relativism just didn't exist. So you had people, but I think I like John Sobieski, the Polish king, and I think he's also relevant because he's the closest to our times as opposed to the earlier battles, 1683, Siege of Vienna. I mean, he called it a holy war. He saw it for what it was. He didn't think these guys were coming because, they're poor migrants or they have grievances. He said they're coming because they're out to destroy Christianity, and they're motivated by a diabolical animus and so forth. And by the way, a lot of the other, Christian emperors and fighters said the same thing. But we're lucky to have a lot of his words actually preserved as opposed to the earlier emperors. Another one I like, who's very little known, is Leo III, and he's the Byzantine emperor, and he's in the 7th century. He had what I would call a very refreshing interfaith dialogue with the Caliph Uthman, or actually, I'm sorry, Omar II. An interfaith dialogue because Omar called on him to convert to Islam, called on Leo, the emperor, and Leo responded in a long letter, and he just called out all the flaws of Islam that we were discussing in a very honest, open way, not to mock Islam, but basically saying, how can you believe in this prophet who was a pedophile, whose claim to fame is that he was able to conquer and destroy and kill and so forth. So I think a lot of the proponents of interfaith dialogue can learn something from Leo III.
What do you hope readers take away from Sword and Scimitar?
Well, basically, the working question that I had when I first started writing this book is the Islamic State Islamic or not? And I decided, I'm not going to take the easy way and answer it from a theological point of view by quoting the Quran or the Hadith or the words of Muhammad, all of which, of course, support violence and jihad. I said, I'm going to put that away because it's abstract, and let's look at what Muslims have said to and done in the West historically, which is harder to do. And that's what I did, and I documented it. And I think when you see what Muslims have said to and done in the West for literally 14 centuries, and you find out that it's a perfect duplicate of what ISIS is doing, except it was even more exponential because you had a lot more people involved, massive armies and massive, decisive, cataclysmic battles, then I think the question of is ISIS Islamic or not becomes really silly. And the answer is yes, of course it's Islamic. It's following in the footsteps of its forebears and so forth in a very unwavering way. And if anything, it's more Islamic than so many other Muslim people. And I know there's peaceful Muslims and so forth, and I'm not discounting that. But ISIS is more emblematic and more representative of historic Islam over a millennium of it than, the local moderate Muslim that works down the street in 7-Eleven who I, joke around with in the morning.
And we met quite a few in Jerusalem and other cities on our tour of Israel back in May, who would just as soon live peacefully alongside the Israelis without getting involved in the stuff that Hamas is stirring up in Gaza. Yeah. But your book really makes it clear that if anything, the Islamic State is a purer form of Islam than what we are being told by the media here in the West. And I appreciate you writing the book, appreciate you taking time to talk about it. The book is Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. Raymond Ibrahim is the author. His website, RaymondIbrahim.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. And Raymond, really enjoyed the conversation. I'd like to do it again sometime.
Likewise, Derek. Thanks for having me. It's
eye-opening. It is stunning when you realize how much of Western history has been left out of the books. I mean, think about that. 1683, and the Ottoman Empire was at the gates of Vienna. And just, it's astonishing that for 1,000 years, the Mediterranean was too dangerous to travel, and that's why the Renaissance and the Enlightenment didn't happen, because the books of those Greek philosophy could not physically be transported safely from Constantinople to Paris and London. It's incredible. RaymondIbrahim.com. Again, check the show notes at Spreaker.com or vftb.net, wherever you're listening to this podcast. And I encourage you to get a copy of Sword and Scimitar. Tomorrow, December 10th, in Jerusalem somewhere, the Sanhedrin is going to consecrate the stone altar for the Third Temple. Bearing in mind that the Third Temple will occupy a place currently occupied by a mosque. Significant? You bet. We'll talk to Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat next on A View from the Bunker.
Tens of thousands of people nationwide are scrambling to be the first one to solve the new Belly of the Beast anagram challenge.
Welcome, adventurer. You are invited to undertake a search for the answer to the most explosive discovery in the history of the United States and biblical prophecy.
Mystery surrounding the new documentary Belly of the Beast is spreading excitement everywhere. One lucky winner, able to crack the anagram, will walk away with $10,000, while 10 runner-ups will receive shopping sprees at Skywatch TV store just in time for Christmas.
Soon, what has never been revealed before, an enigma that connects the most powerful nation on earth to the coming of a new age god, will be revealed. The exact and secret location where this Antichrist will rise from the dead will be unveiled. It is underground, guarded by members of the Rosy Cross, Freemasons, and the most powerful members of the ancient Order of the Quest, those who are prepared to conduct the arcane raising ceremony.
To learn this astonishing secret, a series of codes will be posted for 3 weeks at skywatchtv.com starting November 20 and leading up to the posting of an anagram on December 4. The first person to decipher the anagram and call the phone number provided will be awarded $10,000 in cold, hard cash. 10 runner-ups will receive shopping sprees at the Skywatch TV store. To learn more, visit skywatchtv.com/contest.
A new take on the prophesied war of Gog and Magog. A new take on the prophesied war of Gog and Magog. Forget about Russia coming from the uttermost parts of the north. The enemy foreseen by the prophet Ezekiel is so much bigger and so much older. It's Last Clash of the Titans by Derek P. Gilbert, a #1 new release in Amazon's Christian history category. Last Clash of the Titans breaks down step by step how Greek mythology grew out of Canaanite religion, why the old gods of the Greeks, the Titans, were the Watchers who descended on the summit of Mount Hermon, and why the Titans will return from the abyss for one final battle against God, Armageddon. Last Clash of the Titans, backed up by peer-reviewed academic research. Tom Horn calls this book stunning. Last Clash of the Titans, the second coming of Hercules, Leviathan, and the prophesied war between Jesus Christ and the gods of antiquity. Get it as part of a special offer at skywatchtvstore.com and available now in paperback and as a Kindle ebook at amazon.com. From a ridgetop location deep in the heart of the Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Next week, our guest lived as a gay man and then as a woman, but now he proclaims the gospel of Jesus Christ. David Arthur, our guest next Sunday night. That is December 17th here on A View from the Bunker. Make that December 16th. Losing track of what day I am in. Well, tonight's broadcast has been a little bit rough, running a little bit late, but I hope the content has made it worthwhile as the information that Raymond Ibrahim chronicles in his book is absolutely essential to understanding history and why we are where we are. And now we shift from history of Islam to really a Jewish eschatology. as we're looking at events taking place in Israel and in Jerusalem in particular that have prophetic significance for us as Christians as well. Although it's not that we are hoping for the construction of a third temple. We know that's not necessary any longer. We have our high priest already in the throne room of God himself. But our Jewish brothers and sisters are looking for the construction of the third temple. And tomorrow, Monday, December 10th, the Sanhedrin, the rabbinic court, is hosting a ceremony somewhere in Jerusalem to consecrate the stone altar for the third temple. Joining us, I'm making it sound like this is live. Earlier this week, via Skype from Tel Aviv, we talked to our friend, the founder of Messiah of Israel Ministries, raised as a rabbi in this culture, and now proclaiming the gospel on the streets of Israel. We welcome our friend Rabbi Zev Porat and ask Zev, how significant is this event that's taking place on Monday?
Well, it's very, very significant, Derek, because if you know anything about the Sanhedrin, and we say Sanhedrin in Israel, although they were rebuilt again in Israel, we need to understand that the rabbinic movement in Israel is the Sanhedrin, whether they're called the Sanhedrin or not. But right now they're officially called the Sanhedrin again. And it's very, very significant because if you know anything about the Sanhedrin, they're involved in persecuting believers. They're involved in persecuting the Messianic Jews in Israel. And for them to come out with this statement and to say in Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, that they want to dedicate the altar with the 70 nations is huge. We see it here as an end-time event, Bible prophecy being fulfilled, not because there is a third temple or not a third temple, because the fact that the gospel is getting out and they're realizing that without the nations, they really can't do what they want to do, whether it's biblical or not, and they understand that the love of the nations for Israel is what's generating this. So all the years of the Christians coming to Israel and praying for Israel, the fruits of that is coming out right now because the Sanhedrin want to unite together with the 70 nations. And in fact, I had the opportunity to call the Sanhedrin this afternoon and ask him about this, and they were quite willing to speak to me on the phone. Shocked for my questions, but they didn't hang up the phone when they found out that I'm a Messianic Jew, which is amazing to me because usually they would do that.
So now doing this during Hanukkah. Hanukkah, of course, is the celebration of the miracle of the menorah in the temple during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, the Greek king of Syria back in the 2nd century BC, who desecrated the temple. That was the abomination of desolation, the first time anyway. Where he set up the altar or a bust of Zeus in the temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar, if I remember correctly. Am I getting that right? And how is that significant then that the Sanhedrin is choosing this festival to invite the nations to participate in the new temple?
Well, they realize, first of all, that this is speaking about the Feast of the Lights.
Yeah.
And they know that the nations are part of the lights. We talk about the 7 B'nai Noach, the 7 rules or 7 laws of Noah. And the 7 laws of Noah apply also to the Gentiles according to the rabbis. But they have a little bit of a different take on it. And I want to touch a little bit on the 7 laws of Noah because that would explain why they chose the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah, to come out with this statement and to do this.
Okay.
Well, the 7 laws of Noah basically come from the Talmud, and we know as the Oral Torah. And it says that the Gentiles can actually go to heaven and become righteous if they don't abide in adultery. Now, what they're really saying, and that's what I spoke with a rabbi today, Rabbi Dov from the Sanhedrin in Israel, what they're saying is this. They're saying, as a Gentile, you can actually be a partaker of Israel if you abide in the 7 laws of Noah. Now, you and I understand that the 7 laws of Noah are not biblical. It's not from the Bible. It comes from the rabbis. But what are they saying? What are they saying? They're saying, Derek, that if you follow what the rabbis teach, you can actually be a Gentile that's righteous. Basically, you need to deny Jesus. You need to deny Yeshua because one of the 7 laws of Noah is that you are not to have adultery. And in their eyes, if you believe in Jesus, it's adultery. That's what they call it, or blasphemy. So basically, you can't abide in the 7 laws of Noah according to the rabbis unless you deny the name of Jesus. Same thing happened last year when they said no messianic weddings. You can't marry as a messianic Jew if you don't deny the name of Jesus. Also, it comes in with the 7 laws of Noah. So when we hear the 7 laws of Noah, it seems to look from the outside, oh, these rabbis really want to unite with the nations. They do and they don't. They do if you abide in them, and they don't if you don't abide in them. What they really want is they want you to be a partakers of the finances to build the third temple. That's what they're saying. And they don't want to hear the name of Jesus spoken. And I was told this by the rabbi today.
So the Noahide laws, it looks like an olive branch, to use a metaphor, like an opportunity to join peacefully with the Jewish religious leadership, but in fact, it's a way of luring Christians back into a works-based salvation and out of the grace that we are offered through our faith in Jesus Christ.
Absolutely. I see the enemy. You're talking about Antiochus desecrating the temple. We're the temple of God. Our bodies are the temple. We're living sacrifices according to the Bible. And he's trying to desecrate the temple of God in an indirect way by having the Christians around the world, whether they know it or not, follow or abide into the 7 laws of Noah that are not biblical. And how do you do that? How do you join? You're basically going to have to go and not proclaim Jesus as the Messiah, and then you can become righteous according to the 7 laws of Noah of the rabbi. So yes, it is kind of lowering you into a trap.
This is, again, it's a difficult, tightrope to walk because we want to be faithful to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. On the other hand, we don't want to, alienate our brothers and sisters in Israel because they are the people to whom the Word of God first came, and without the olive, obviously the root of this vine is Jesus Christ himself, the Messiah, but we've been grafted in, so we cannot claim that we as Gentiles who've accepted Jesus Christ are in any way superior to Israel. Again, how do we witness in love? Understanding that the Sanhedrin is opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ. How do we witness to our Jewish brothers and sisters in love? How do you do it?
Well, first of all, Derek, if there is going to be an 8th day of Hanukkah next week, a dedication of the altar or lighting the menorah, I'm going to be there. That's for sure, and I encourage other believers to be there. We don't have a location yet, but I don't tell believers to go over there and say Jesus is the Messiah and provoke them to jealousy. But I am saying to be a light to them, to love them, and if you're asked your faith, you can't deny the name of Jesus. You have to say that I'm a believer of Yeshua, and he's the Jewish Messiah. He's your Messiah. He's our Messiah. But basically, how do we witness to them? By loving them, by not compromising the Word of God. When Paul said, to the Jew I was a Jew, and to the Gentile I was a Gentile, what he meant was we are sensitive to their culture without compromising the Word of God. So it is a tight rope to walk on. We just have to be a light and preach the truth to them in love. And what a wonderful time to do this in Hanukkah. But again, if it comes at a cost of either pleasing them or pleasing our Messiah, Yeshua, God, we have to choose God.
Amen. Amen. So from the standpoint of significance prophetically, this consecration ceremony, and I understand that it's not set yet as to where it's going to be for security reasons, because obviously the Muslims in Israel understand the significance of this. But again, for us in the West, how big a deal is this? I mean, we're talking about the spiritual heart of Jewish life and faith. I mean, how do we grasp this here as Christians in the West as to how important this thing is?
It's huge. Look at the time we're in, the 70th year of the nation of Israel. The fact that they're talking about the 70 nations, which comes from Genesis 10. We have the list of the 70 nations in the Bible. The fact that they're speaking about this in the 70th year of the nation of Israel, when the U.S. Embassy has already been moved to Jerusalem in this huge year, when we had 4 years of celebration in Yom Ha'atzmaut, in the Independence Day. It's prophetically a picture for us that the second coming of Jesus is close. We're not setting any dates, but it's huge. And the fact that the veil is being lifted in Israel today, Jews are coming to faith in Messiah Yeshua, and that is a fact. And we view this as a prophetic move of the Sanhedrin. It really doesn't matter what their motivation is. The fact that they're willing to sit together with us, rejoice with us together in the same room, is a big step, Derek, and a testimony to other Jews here in Israel who all they've been seeing for the past decade is persecution of believers. And now with this declaration, The secular streets here in Israel are speaking about it. They're in shock. How can it be that the Sanhedrin invites the nations in Hanukkah? This is blasphemy. How can this be? And we're saying it's not blasphemy. It's the hand of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob on the land of Israel. Now, it's huge, Derek.
So this is an opportunity, perhaps, as you're going to take advantage of on Monday to be there. This is an opportunity. The Sanhedrin, maybe not even understanding exactly why they're doing this, but to open the door, perhaps, to believers who may be able to show this kind of love, which would surprise them, given the 2,000 years of anger and animosity between Jews and Christians, which is the work of the enemy, Satan and his minions. The Sanhedrin is opening the door.
It's unbelievable. It's incredible, Derek. And even if there's not going to be a ceremony on Monday, one thing is certain. The offices of the Sanhedrin are going to be open. The Temple Institute is going to be open. And we're going to be there, and we're going to be talking to people. If it doesn't happen, it's because of security reasons or something else. But the land of Israel, the 8,200,000 people that live here in Israel, Arabs and Jews, all know about this. You may have read it on breaking news or read it on Israel Today, but it's all over the Israeli newspapers. It's all over the news. It's all over the media here. It's all over the radio. And it's causing an earthquake in a good way. And all the glory goes to Jesus, Yeshua. The Sanhedrin may not even know that they're used for such a time like this.
Yeah.
They're hard to believe it.
Now, let me bring this in because we're looking forward to this. We're less than 6 months away now from returning to Israel and seeing your homeland once again, seeing you and your lovely wife Lynn on your home turf as we get to the conclusion of the 70th year of Israel's independence. Explain from your perspective why people watching this might want to take advantage of this opportunity to join us on this 10-day tour of Israel in May.
Well, it's always great to come to Israel. But I don't believe that we're going to have an opportunity to come again in the next 70 year. I'm not setting any dates, but I am saying the time is near. Most of us will not be alive in 70 years. This opportunity to come to Israel in the 70th year, as we're going to a closure of that year, in the outpouring of the Jubilee, is huge. And to be with Derek, Sharon Gilbert, Carl Gallups, I mean, what a team. And to walk the footsteps of Yeshua, Jesus, is a call. It's an altar call. I'm calling an altar call right now to come to Israel and to join us and to be a light in the year where the Sanhedrin are calling the 70th nations to be partakers. Doesn't matter what the motivation is. You have an opportunity to walk in the footsteps of Yeshua, to walk in Jerusalem, and to be a light in the dark nation of Israel right now with the light of Jesus. It's going to be huge, Derek. I really recommend people to sign up and go.
Yeah, we are really, really looking forward to it this time around. Zev, now I know you recorded a video about this Sanhedrin event. Where would people follow or watch that video? Where do they follow your ministry online?
It was just put online like about 2 minutes ago at Messiah of Israel Ministries.org. You'll see a YouTube button there. Just click on the YouTube button, take you right to our channel. You'll see the first video there, breaking news. And you can see me actually calling the Sanhedrin today and having a conversation with them in English and in Hebrew.
Okay. Can we talk to you next week after the ceremony?
If Jesus didn't come back, absolutely.
All right. We'll set a time, and we'll pray for you, brother, as you have an opportunity there that it just appears to be once in a lifetime. Rabbi Zev Porat, his website, messiahofisraelministries.com, also zevporatministries.com. Zev, appreciate your time, and we'll talk with you again very soon.
Always the blessing to be here, and looking forward to seeing you soon, Eric.
This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Kind of an overtime tonight. We normally try to keep this to a 2-hour program, but with the interviews we had, we kind of ran a little bit long, and then some distraction in the first half hour with the connection issues with Spreaker.com. It looks like the connection's been pretty solid for the last hour or thereabouts, but so your forgiveness, I hope, for the rough part of the broadcast there as I was trying to figure out whether or not we were actually streaming a signal to the internet. It looks like we have, but it looks like it's been broken into about 6 different pieces. So we'll check on that tonight, but the archives will be there. If you're listening to this in the archive, forget all of this. Just strike this from the record because for you, it won't even matter. Anyway, just a couple of quick things, even though we're in overtime, because I talked about these earlier. And this first one I think is relevant because of the interview with Raymond Ibrahim earlier and his book, Sword and Scimitar, and sort of the cultural ignorance that we in the West have about the significance of Islam in our history. How from the 7th century until really the late 17th century, for about 1,000 years, it was just, it was a constant threat. Islam was a constant threat to Christendom, not just the Christian lands that were very quickly overrun. Palestine, Israel, Syria, what is now Iraq, Egypt, all of those nations were at one point, those are the earliest Christian communities in the world. And now we think of them as, they've always been Muslim nations, so not so. But here in the West, we are so open-minded that we are constantly in danger of our brains falling out. Another bit of evidence, a grade school principal in Nebraska banned candy canes this Christmas because the J shape of the candy cane might stand for Jesus. I first thought this story was made up. One of those websites that puts out clickbait for Christians. Stories that are so over the top that they must be fake, but they get us to share them through social media. Well, it turns out this one is actually true. Manchester Elementary School in Omaha, or rather Omaha Manchester Elementary School. This is Elkhorn, Nebraska. Principal there put out a list of things she was banning during the weeks leading up to Christmas, which included Christmas trees in classrooms, Santa Claus and Christmas items, singing Christmas carols, playing Christmas music, the elf on the shelf. Now, please understand, I recognize that most of these things really have nothing at all to do with Jesus, Christ and Christianity. I get that. I understand that. Most of these are just the cultural traditions that have grown up around Christmas over the centuries. But this is how divorced we have become from even Christian tradition, not even biblical tradition, but Christian tradition. That in our desire to be culturally sensitive and inclusive, we're banning candy canes from elementary schools because the J might stand for Jesus. Mm-hmm. Another bit of sensitivity as we once again try to erase history to avoid offending anybody. The very famous high school in New York City that inspired the musical Fame, this is the LaGuardia High School, banned the use of Nazi flags in a school production. Now, you might think that's really a good idea, except the school production that they were presenting at the school was The Sound of Music. And the whole point of the Von Trapp's family story is how they rebelled against the Nazis. It's a little difficult to have Nazis without their symbols. But the principal, Lisa Mars, ordered that the flags and symbols were to be removed from the stage and from the set of The Sound of Music because they might offend somebody. Kind of loses the impact. And one final note as we close out this Sunday, December 9th. College student in California has asserted that a popular child's cartoon, which has been around for, almost 30 years now? At least 20, should be banned because it's racist. That cartoon series is Veggie Tales. Yes. Veggie Tales dangerous because it promotes racial stereotypes by making the villains racial minorities. This came up during an annual whiteness forum at Cal State San Marcos, where students are invited to discuss specific topics related to systematic racism in America. Veggie Tales. When you start throwing around that word and applying it to things like this, the word has lost all meaning. It's silly. Racism is a thing. And as Christians, we reject it. We are to judge one another on the strength of our character. But when you start taking it and applying it to things like Veggie Tales to make a point, the word loses all meaning. When everything is racist, then nothing is racist anymore. And the activists have actually become their own worst enemies. Very quickly, in 2019, a few things to tell you about the Hear the Watchman conference coming up in late March, March 28th through 31st. It's in Dallas, Texas, Grapevine, Texas, actually, which is next door to Dallas. The Hilton DFW Lakes Conference Center, very close to the airport, easy to get to. And featured speakers this year, besides Sharon and myself, include L.A. Marzulli, Russ Dizdar, Pastor Carl Gallups, Rabbi Zev Porat, whom you just heard, Pastor Paul Begley, Dr. Michael Lake, Pastor Casper McLeod, Coach Dave Daubenmeyer, Michael Buldea, and more. And right now, you can get in on an early bird discount, plus an extra $20 off if you use the promo code Gilbert20. That's Gilbert20. At hearthewatchmen.com. The True Legends Conference comes back to Branson next September 13th through the 15th. Got more details coming on that one. It'll be back at the Mansion Theater again. And next October, Sharon and I will be part of a new conference put on by a ministry called I-4029. Isaiah 4029, I-4029 Ministries. L.A. Marzulli, Russ Dizdar, Bill Salas will be there, among others. John Schlitt, we just learned, will be providing music. John Schlitt, lead singer of the legendary Christian rock band Petra, be there to provide the music. So that's October 4th through the 6th, 2019. Details on that forthcoming. And we can now reveal the first annual Skywatch TV Defender Conference. Mark your calendar, August 2nd through 4th of 2019. This will be at the Radisson Hotel in Branson, site of the old Future Congress conferences back, 7 years ago. Tom Horn, Dr. Michael Heiser, Pastor Carl Gallups, Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis, Dr. Michael Lake, and more. And special musical performance by Dino Kartsanakis. So, more details on that, but the website is up and online. It is at defenderconference.com. Again, it's still early days on that. More details coming, defenderconference.com. So, we will have the archived version up at Spreaker, so if it didn't record to Spreaker.com correctly, we will take the version we've been recording offline here and substitute it so you'll get the whole thing without skipping and stopping, which was a problem throughout tonight's broadcast. We appreciate it if you take a moment to leave a review at Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever else you find A View from the Bunker. Give us a like on Facebook. And remember, A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House and released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. The opening theme is by Kevin MacLeod. It's called Iron Bacon. His website is www.incompetech.com. Our announcer is DC Good. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Next week, December 16th, David Arthur joins us here. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.